And this keynote is co-sponsored jointly by the Society for the Anthropology of Religion and the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture. We're very thankful for the generous funding from the UCSB Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life, which is directed by a previous speaker, Greg Johnson. The work of the anthropologist for whom this keynote lecture is named, Roy A. Rappaport, is very relevant for the themes of both of our conferences. For SAR, it's religiosities, ecologies, and environmentalisms in the age of the Anthropocene. And for ISSRNC, it's crossing borders, transgressing boundaries, religion, migration, and climate change. Roy Rappaport's book, Pigs for the Ancestors, Ritual in the Ecology of a New Guinea People, published in 1968, was ahead of its time and became an anthropological classic. It was one of the earliest to examine how religion, ecology, and human and non-human populations are intertwined. Among the Zambaga, a pig feasting and a non-state complex kinship society, the ritual cycle of pig raising and pig feasting served as a mechanism for the systemic regulation of not only social relations among human groups, but also horticultural rhythms, the conservation of domesticated and wild fauna, and the protection of the natural environment. I remember when I was a postdoc at University of Michigan many moons ago, when Skip, which was his nickname, Roy Rappaport's nickname, was still on this earth. And he treated me to lunch. When the waiter asked for his name to put down in his waiting list, Skip playfully gave the name of Arturo. So he's a very playful guy and very enjoyable to be with. So in this keynote lecture, we're very happy that Professor Ana Mariella Bacigalupo has agreed to give the keynote lecture. She's a professor of anthropology at SUNY Buffalo. She works with indigenous Mapuche natives in Chile, and she also works with pan-indigenous communities in Northern Peru. She has a very impressive publication record, including 70 articles. Her recent books include Thunder Shaman, Making History with Mapuche Spirits in Patagonia, Shamans of the Foi Tree, which is another book, Gender, Power, and Healing Among the Chilean Mapuche. And another book is The Voice of the Drum in Modernity, Tradition and Change in the Practice of 7 Mapuche Shamans. She's also co-edited a special issue of the journal Religion titled Subversive Religiosities and More Than Human Materialities in Latin America. Professor Bacigalupo is currently writing a new book titled The Subversive Politics of Ancestor Mountains, Collective Ethics and Climate Justice in Northern Peru. Bacigalupo's research has been funded by an incredible array of academic institutions, including the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the Max Planck Institute, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, National Endowment for Humanities, the National Humanities Center, the School for Advanced Research, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Stanford Humanities Center, the Netherlands Institute of Advanced Study, the Fulbright Foundation, the Wenner Gren Foundation, the International Association of University Women, and the Divinity School and the Center for World Religions at Harvard. A longer version of this lecture is forthcoming in the journal of your ISSRNC called Journal for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture. Professor Bacigalupo's research entails original analysis of pressing relevance to the anthropology of religion. And her research has moved from a focus on indigenous Mapuche healing rituals to Mapuche personhood, embodiment, and the queering of shamanism, and also death and rebirth, social memory, temporality and history, graphic and performative literacies, traumatic memory, and cosmopolitics. Her more recent work is focused on the personhood of landscapes and materiality, political ontology, climate change and disasters, and environmental justice through shamanism. Let's welcome Professor Bacigalupo.
Thank you so much, Mayfair, for that generous introduction and for inviting me to the conference. And also thank you for Lisa Sedaris and to Amanda Nichols, who have been extraordinary in making this happen. I really want to thank them for bringing us all together, and also for all of you for being here today. I was profoundly inspired by the panel that came right before us, that really spoke about the ways in which indigenous people engage with the environment and nature in different ways. And I really want to thank the panelists for your contributions and your wisdom. I hope that what I'm speaking about today will add something to that. So one of the greatest challenges of our current climate crisis is overcoming our anthropocentrism, our sole focus on human welfare and justice between humans at the expense of the planet. Despite the vast attention granted to natural places as kin, who challenge the dichotomy of subject and object and the sovereignty of culture over nature, few scholars consider how a radically anti-anthropocentric understanding of the world may help to rewrite the global climate change debate. And that is my goal today. Some scholars have made important strides by decentering the human and focusing on our relationships with others to save the planet. So some people like Isabel Stengers, Donna Haraway, for example, write that we must look at the world from non-human points of view and consider different kinds of agents and agencies as part of an interrelated planetary system where humans must play well with others in order to survive. Bruno Latour adds that unless we see our planet as a living being that regulates the climate and responds to how we treat it, we will lack the will to change our life. Now, indigenous shamans have been doing this for centuries. They exhort non-indigenous people to become their allies in the urgent need to engage the agential world to save the planet from predatory capitalism and environmental destruction. In the powerful film Aluna, An Ecological Warning, indigenous Kogi shamans from the Colombian Sierra Madre teach non-indigenous people to engage the landscapes with agency and to read the signs of environmental catastrophe. The goal is to share the burden of healing the dying planet with non-indigenous people. In his book, The Falling Sky, indigenous Yanomami shaman David Kapanawa narrates the cosmo-ecological consciousness of the world. He warns about the impending environmental cataclysm, the revenge of nature, if non-indigenous people continue to disregard the agency of nature for their financial gain. Truly recognizing this anti-anthropocentric agency of nature and its impact on climate change, however, is a daunting task. Our climate change discourses are infused with ethics derived from anthropocentric beliefs and practices. Abrahamic religions imagine that humans are created in God's image to have dominion or stewardship over Earth and its creatures. Capitalism then reinforces the idea that our exploitation and commodification of nature is a small price to pay for profit, accumulation, and Western standards of living. Scholarly concepts in the social sciences and humanities are also deeply shaped by social and political processes that cut us off from the earth and make us imagine that we are the only subjects on the planet. What then will inspire humans to take a moral responsibility by responding to the climate crisis for the benefit of the planet? And how can the study of religion help with this task? Since our beliefs and practices shape our attitudes towards climate change, major religions could benefit from emphasizing a belongingness to the earth to meet the challenge of catastrophic climate crisis. And we've heard a number of papers in these past few days that do exactly that, which I'm really happy to hear. In her 2002 presidential address at the American Academy of Religion, Mayra Rivera argues that the study of religion must heal from these epistemic fractures between humans and particular ecologies, between time and place, and between the geopolitical and the ecological. She further emphasized that for our collective futures, we have much to learn from communities who have suffered and survived multiple catastrophes. And that's what I'm going to look at today. These local narratives are also a global story, a new possibility for collective engagement with the earth in the future. To this end, I ask, what could be the implications for our climate crisis of truly decentering the human? How do landscapes conceived as ancestors expand what we understand by politics and justice and how we practice them? How can the logics of these ancestor landscapes and scientific climate change discourses work together towards a common end? And what kind of post-apocalyptic visions could trigger our moral responsibility towards the earth? I seek to answer these questions through my ethnographic work by engaging the experiences of shamans or curanderos in their diverse communities in the regions of La Libertad, Lambayeque, and Piura in northern Peru. These communities are a mix of coastal people of indigenous and Spanish descent and indigenous people from the Amazon and the Andes who self-identify as norteños, northerners. They have been ravaged by colonialism, the Spanish Catholic extirpation of idolatries, evangelical missionaries, and the exploitation of their bodies and lands through intensive agriculture and gold mining. Since 2014, they've also suffered catastrophic heat, rains, and El Niño floods exacerbated by climate change, which many norteños experience as the end of humanity. A cook named Claudia explained. El Niño of 2023 was 1,000 times stronger than the one of 2017 because it combined the cyclone Yaku with the coastal El Niño phenomenon and global climate change. The ocean water is very hot and triggered a change of terrifying events: strong winds, buckets of rain, floods collapsing the drainage and water system, swarms of mosquitoes. The street and plaza are full of sewage water. We will have terrible epidemics of dengue, Zika, and hepatitis, and we will all die. Like many indigenous and black people, norteños and their non-human relations have already experienced what Catherine Yusuf calls multiple Anthropocenes, that is, many exterminations, many endings of worlds. Through their myriad catastrophes, norteño gain a deep understanding of the entanglement between the humans and the earth, between time and space, which allows them to find ways to manage the climate crisis and create visions of post-apocalyptic futures. Specifically, they experience mountains as ancestors, or apu, beings with a higher consciousness who both respond to and impact ecological catastrophes that are connected to climate change. Norteños' experience with these apus can offer insights into how we can change our relationships with the earth as climate change ravages the world. Now, since the massive floods starting in 2014, norteños have returned to indigenous materialized practices with apus, enabling them to adapt and survive in the face of these correlated catastrophes. In this system, humans have a moral obligation to engage in reciprocal relations with apus who grant them resources. Human behavior is therefore constrained and directed towards stabilizing ecological systems, preventing climate change, and managing resources. But apus also hold power over humans and destroy them with floods and illnesses if they violate these obligations, especially when they contaminate the water and soil and destroy it with mining extractivism. Now, to engage in these anti-anthropocentric understandings of climate change, I'm going to use a decolonizing, reflexive approach, which recognizes and confronts the colonial legacies in the categories and perspectives produced and reproduced by social sciences and people in the humanities. And this includes, the kind of problematic distinctions that have been pointed out by many people here. The distinctions between subject and object, nature and culture, matter and spirit, which are central to Western epistemologies and have marginalized indigenous people and their knowledges. So my decolonial approach draws on the knowledges and frames of reference used by norteños, recognizing them as interpreters and collaborators in the production of knowledge. And I engage in these community participatory kind of research centered on these epistemologies and experiences of norteños and the curanderos in their terms. So by recognizing landscapes as kin and social actors who act upon the world and ourselves as humans, we can reframe the climate change debate from the point of view of non-humans. I gained an understanding of this in the past 10 years through my engagement with norteños, and particularly with a rain curandero or shaman by the name of Ombayek, whose name means guardian of the water, whom I first met in 2015 in Trujillo. Ombayek was well known for channeling the healing powers of his Apu Cuculicote and for predicting rains and floods. Norteños recognize curanderos like Ombayek as unique in their capacity to move outside of human cognition because they experience the world through multiple perspectives of beings that they channel. So birds, snakes, jaguars, apus, lakes, and sacred plants, such as the San Pedro cactus. Curanderos, therefore, understand the world as a totality. When Ombayek learned that I was born in Lima, but that my father's family are indigenous Andean Quechua, and that I knew how to feed apus with prayers, coca leaves, chicha, sweetbreads, and fruit, he asked me to join him in a healing ritual for patients at Cuculicote. After the ritual, Ombayek asked me to write about his entanglements with apus as crucial to addressing the climate change crisis before he died. He saw in me an opportunity to get his story out. Ombayek knew I was competent in shamanic lore since I spent 25 years working with Mapuche shamans in Chile and published a number of books on alternative perspectives on body, personhood, history, gender, and time. Ombayek trusted that I could translate between his knowledge system and that of academics in the same way he translated between the world of non-humans and humans. Ombayek's eschatology is consistent with Andean perspectives of Pachacutic, which is where a catastrophic destruction of an established world order is then followed by the beginning of a new order and represents a reversal of the previous world. Now, this new world will eventually end with a similar apocalypse. In the Quechua language, Pacha means both earth and time, collapsing time and space together, and Cutic means a return or reversal. So indigenous people throughout the Americas hold a similar eschatology where end times are therefore also beginning times. Since the creation of a new world involves the return to a previous world, the post-apocalyptic world and the pre-apocalyptic world are alike in being without humans. Now, today, indigenous world turning all over the Americas is habitually produced by catastrophic social, political, and environmental events caused by predatory extractivism. A new world order usually involves a return to a previous world ruled by non-human beings, often ancestor landscapes or kin in the forms of animals and plants. So between 2015 and 2024, I worked closely with Ombayek, participating in many of his rituals and those of other curanderos, and recording his visions, healing songs, and conversations with a variety of non-humans and patients. He taught me how to interpret the language of apus, mysterious exploding sounds at night, falling rocks and stars, fog, clear skies, the temperature and force of winds, sounds at night, the movement of birds, whistles. We fed many landscapes and pre-Columbian temples and asked them for permission to visit and for knowledge. We also traveled the mountains where Ombayek predicted rains and floods through biometrics and talked with birds, insects, petroglyphs, and Moche indigenous shamans from times past. We visited the marketplace to buy medicinal plants and perfumes, and we talked for many hours about visionary landscapes, climate change, and post-apocalyptic worlds. Ombayek developed pulmonary fibrosis from exposure to toxins and died at the age of 72 during El Niño floods of 2023. I hope my words and interpretations do justice to his vision. Ombayek's motivation for having me write a book about his relationship with Apu was twofold. First, he wanted his entanglement to the earth to gain authority among an English-speaking audience and global environmental movements. He hoped that this might eventually reduce the environmental devastation and greenhouse gas emissions wrought by Canadian, American, and European mining companies in the Peruvian north. Second, he hoped that his book would warn humanity that the world is already ending for Norteños and will soon end for the rest of humanity unless we learn to entangle ourselves with the earth. By learning from Peruvian shamans who found creative ways to survive environmental, social, and economic catastrophes, we can create a collective vision of the earth as subject and imagine new possibilities for the future. Ombayek's engagement with Cuculicote needs to be understood within a complex historical and political process that enabled the contemporary reemergence of ethical obligations with apus in northern Peru. indigenous Moche and Chimu people were first colonized by Andean Inca, who promoted engagement with Apu in Quechua terms. Then they were colonized by Catholic Spaniards, Peruvian priests and evangelical missionaries who attempted to root out idolatries, demonize shamans as witches, and drive engagement with Apus underground. Middle class and upper class Peruvians still reject Apus as a form of demonic animism because they threaten Christian monotheism, Western divisions between humans and landscapes, and the interest of extractive industries. Apus reemerged publicly when curanderismo, or shamanism, was repopularized in the late 1980s after the discovery of tombs of Moche shamanic rulers amid the rise of spiritual tourism. Curanderos tempered the colonial history of the Peruvian North and began to feed crosses and shrines as well as Apus. In the 1990s, American and Peruvian academics legitimated the syncretic healing of curanderos through scholarly writings and collaborative conferences with curanderos. And then, when there was an extreme cycle of flooding in 2014, human engagement with Apus rose sharply, and locals included Apus in community movements. Ombayek and other curanderos founded 3 local movements for collective ethics and climate justice, led by Apu Campana: Asociación de Rescate y Defensa de Apu Campana, Colectivo Comunidad Consciente, and Apoyarte Perú. And by putting the Apu as the leader of these movements, they really expand what we understand by politics and how we practice it. Furthermore, in 2022, the Peruvian Ministry of Culture recognized the use of huachuma, which is the San Pedro mescaline cactus, in curanderos, mediating curanderos' relationship with Apus in northern Peru as a form of cultural patrimony that needs to be endorsed and protected. And this recognition gave an enormous boost to the practice and legitimacy of curanderos' relationships to Apu. Now, norteños engage landscapes as agents of planetary ethics and justice. They experience mountain ancestors like Cuculicote, Apo Cuculicote, and the enchanted Andean lakes like Shimbe, Encanto Shimbe, as 2 different kinds of ancestral landscapes. These landscapes include human societies because they're ancestors, because from all of them, all societies emerge and are sustained. But Apus and Encantos are also landscapes with powers that derive from a geological time of the beginning of the earth and will remain long after humans are gone. Apo Cuculicote and Encanto Shimbe therefore must be engaged respectfully and fed offerings by humans in order to live. According to curanderos, Shimbe and Cuculicote sense, feel, and act upon anthropogenic climate change. Their perspective decenters the human, inspires engagement, provides hopeful visions for a post-apocalyptic future, and demonstrates some material practices of justice of ancestral landscapes. For the Andean Quechua in southern Peru, Apu is an honorary title like Lord or Grandfather, granted to powerful humans and landscapes in the southern Andes. In the north of Peru, where I work, however, Apu has an inherently material meaning and refers only to ancestor mountains with specific names and characteristics. Apu Cuculicote, for example, is known for creating, teaching, and healing, but also for destroying, with earthquakes and flood, those who fail to feed him and who extract minerals and stones from his body. Known as the Peruvian queen of origins and lakes, Lake Shimbe is a powerful encanto who grants humans pure water, healing, and power. But when humans fail to feed her perfumes and fruit, or offend her with their litter and corruption, she enchants and eats them, causing humans to die, and then incorporating their life force into her own. The Spanish term encanto refers both to the inherent force of the lake and the accumulated spiritual essences of all the humans who lived and died there. So Cuculicote and Shimbe are not benevolent ancestors who prioritize the life of humans over species who are not destroying the planet. The planet doesn't belong to a dominant human order, nor is it a backdrop for human history. Rather, Apus and Encantos have both life-giving and life-taking abilities, which they use for their growth and survival, and to increase the biodiversity and multi-species ecosystems that make the planet habitable. The goal of Apu and Encanto ancestors is to teach all beings to revive collective interspecies relational ethics, to counteract climate change, and reverse the inequities of extractive capitalism. So in the eyes of Shimbe and Kukulikote, humans only become moral beings to the extent that they're responsible to other species in the planet. Ever since the northern coast of Peru was ravaged by the effects of El Niño floods and mudslides in 2014, exacerbated by climate change, Apus and Encantos like Kukulikote and Shimbe have become concerned with the climate change and the broader environmental damage that humans inflict on the planet, and how our capitalistic greed violates principles of collective ethics and well-being. Today, I want to focus on Apu Kukulikote and Encanto Shimbe's anti-anthropocentric eschatological visions of climate change, which speak about the end of the world and humankind through floods, and a post-apocalyptic future that they're channeled by two curanderos, Jose Garcia and Ombayek, who you can see in the slide here. Because Jose and Ombayek channel multiple agents and agencies in a network that regulate the climate, their visions can really help us better envision our place in a world ravaged by climate change, both today and in the future. They can also help us see how the coming together of human and non-human values and temporal scales must redefine what we mean by politics and justice. On July 8, 2018, I made the 13-hour bus ride with Ombayek from his hometown Ascope in the North Coast to the home of Jose in Huancabamba in the northern Peruvian Andes. I set out with Ombayek and Jose at 4 o'clock the next morning. After a 2-hour truck ride and a 4-hour horseback ride, we arrived at Encanto Shimbe, which is perched majestically 3,900 meters above sea level. Shimbe and her sister lakes have initiated and healed many shamans, including Jose, but Ombayek was initiated by Kukulikote, a mountain on the northern coast of La Libertad. So therefore, Shimbe and Kukulikote are rivals that rule over competing Andean and coastal realms in northern Peru. That day, Jose told us that Shimbe was showing her displeasure. Sheets of rain and hail pummeled us. Gusts of freezing wind cut into our faces. Tornadic water spouts whirled over the lake. Ombayek tripped and fell in the sticky mud surrounding the lake. Ombayek's prayers and the coca leaves he chewed to connect to Shimbe were no match for her wrath. Ombayek turned blue as he kneeled in the mud. He wailed, "She tied up my legs. I cannot move. She's sucking me into the lake. She wants to eat me." Terrified, I shouted to Jose, "Control your lake. She's killing him." Jose was trying to appease Shimbe with maize flour, sugar, fruit, and perfumes. Shaking his best silver rattle, Jose replied humbly, "I cannot control her. Let us hear her will." Ombayek and Jose fell into trance, possessed by Kukulikote and Shimbe, respectively. Kukulikote thanked Shimbe for giving life to the world with her pristine waters and explained that Ombayek had come humbly in search for healing. The rain petered out as Shimbe accepted Kukulikote. Through the curanderos, they spoke. Kukulikote complained via Ombayek's silky voice. "Humans are relentless. They mine me with dynamite and take my stones away in trucks. It hurts, but they don't care. The noise, the mine dust, the heat is unbearable. They exterminate animals, the plants, the water is contaminated. Their sugarcane factories suffocate me with smoke. I'm angry at the stupidity of humans who destroy the world for a coin. I cannot live in peace. I flood them. I send mudslides. I send earthquakes to try and teach them, but they don't understand. Their greed is infinite. I've lost my patience." Through the booming voice of Shimbe, Shimbe replied, "People here resisted the gold mining because they need my water, but they leave garbage on my banks. The plants and animals are dying. Humans are corrupt, lying, killing, stealing. They stink like the dead, but they still ask me to heal them and give nothing back. Corrupt humans are the problem. I will swirl my hail, tornadoes, and illnesses, and humans will die. But animals and plants will live on." "Yes," replied Kukulikote. "After the floods and illnesses destroy humans, we will have a better world. The good humans who feed us and honor us as their ancestors will return to live in our new world as insects and birds, the manifestations and messengers of Apu and Encantos. Shimbe Kukulikote's eschatological narratives offer an expansive view of the order of the planet and humanity's future as climate change ravages the world. They framed humans who continue to defend their privilege built upon colonialism and global capitalism as non-persons who are inseparable from the destruction of other species, the planet, and themselves. These apocalyptic visions, channeled by José and Ombayik, can help us better envision our place in the world, both today and in the future. They can also help us see how the coming together of human and non-human values and temporal scales trigger our ethical responsibility towards the earth and its beings. These apocalyptic visions indicate that when we accept that humanity will ultimately be destroyed by climate change events, we might mitigate our suffering by engaging in ethical, reciprocal multi-species relations to postpone the end of humanity and to reimagine our existence in a post-human world. Kukulikote and Shimbe narrated differing post-apocalyptic futures for humans as contingent on our relationship with ancestral landscapes in this world. So, according to this perspective, humans who destroy the environment and trigger climate change through extractivism and fossil fuel economies will lose their personhood and will be exterminated, while humans who maintain ethical, reciprocal engagement with apus, encantos, and multiple species are persons who will be reborn as birds and insects, the messengers and helpers of apus and encantos. So Kukulikote and Shimbe envision a new anti-anthropocentric world order, a return to an indigenous past without humans that's ruled by ancestral landscapes. And in this, you also see the way in which the narratives of Shimbe and Kukulikote are also decolonizing, and this in many ways, because they're placing norteños at the center of this, saying you're engaging with landscapes, you're having this reciprocal relationship with us, so therefore you will return as a new world as insects and birds, where the others will be exterminated. So it's also giving a certain kind of revaluing of people who are marginalized. Curanderos heal these epistemic fractures we've inherited between humans and ecosystems, between time and place, and between the geopolitical and the ecological. Their interembodied narratives critique the classic script of the Enlightenment, the European anthropocentric language that posits that nature has no subjectivity and agency and is ruled by humans. These narratives also challenge Christian notions of eschatology, where time and the world ends with the extermination of humanity. By decentering the human and gaining awareness of the inevitable end of the space-time of modern industrial civilization and humanity, and of a new world that will exist without us, curanderos inspire us to respond to the climate crisis. As the conversation between Kukulikote and Shimbe illustrates, ancestral landscapes have an ambivalent relationship. Okay, here we go. It's here, actually. Have an ambivalent relationship with humans and prioritize planetary ethics over human survival. They preceded human beings by millennia and are ancestors who created the conditions for human life on Earth by feeding and nourishing humans. Humans are expected to reciprocate by feeding and respecting ancestors and landscapes and other forms of life. But now, Kukulikote and Shimbe feel that the breakdown in relations with humans is irreparable because of this excessive destruction of the world, and that humanity then will be destroyed, and that life force will be incorporated into the landscapes and feed the landscapes. This is why curanderos like Ombayek and José argue that humanity will die from the disasters brought about climate change long before other species. Similarly, many norteños believe that modern society's project of indefinite growth and progress is coming to an end, and that end indicates a new beginning, a turn towards a better, more equitable world without humans. This is a new Pachacuti. This new order is possible because José and Ombayek and Kukulikote and Shimbe refused the separation of human and geological time. This refusal has also been discussed by people like Dipesh Chakrabarti, for example, who argues that the now of human history has become entangled with the long now of geological time. So human extractivism, fossil fuels, and environmental devastation have made such an impact on the planet that we've become a geological agent, right? The whole idea of the Anthropocene, right? And thus our history cannot be recounted from a purely human-centric point of view. At the same time, taking a planetary perspective means understanding that although humans are geological agents, we are also subject to greater planetary forces. And this is evident in the visions by Chimbe and Kukulicote, articulated by curanderos when they say this is going to be the end of humanity. Now, to make sense of these apocalyptic visions, we need to draw on this Andean concept of Pachacuti, right, involving this world reversal or world turning. So this creation of this new world order involves a return to a previous world ruled by ancestor landscapes. By combining and collapsing human and geological time together in this cycle, curanderos can easily move between the past and the future. And this enables apus and encantos to return to this geological time before humans existed, and then to recreate in that space-time those who engage respectfully with ancestral landscapes in this modern industrial world in the form of insects and birds. Curanderos predict that the overturning of the era of extractivism and the beginning of a new Pachacuti ruled by apus and encantos will be marked by these torrential rains and flood, i.e. what's happening now in Peru. This eco-catastrophic narrative that Christophe Bonnel has also talked about, calling for a radical change in dominant ways of living and consuming. Curanderos also call for reestablishing a close relationship with apus and encantos because it's our only viable future is rebirth in a non-human form. So Ombayek says, the apocalypse will affect the whole of humanity, although the poor will suffer from the floods the most, even though it's the greed of the industries that contribute most to the problem. But the ethical poor who feed apu and encantos will return in the new era where apus will rule, and we will live as of plants, insects, and birds. So in this new space-time, those plants and animals will cooperate with ancestral landscapes to create new community life ruled by collective ethics rather than by profit and destruction. Thus, the effects of humans choosing now to re-engage in social relations with apu and encantos will be felt in this post-apocalyptic era, where it will be transformed into insects and birds, even though, of course, this will be without humanity. Now, this is a really important thing. This is very different from previous indigenous Andean Pachacutis. It's also very different from the Native American ghost dance because in the perspective of Chimbe and Kukulicote, they do not oppose the existence of white people, right? Instead, ethnically mixed Norteño, remember that they're a mix of Spanish descendants, people from the coast, Andean, and Amazonian migrants, and other white people, they want to invite humanity to oppose extractive capitalism and find ways to entangle ourselves with the earth. So this is a global invitation that they're putting out there. Curanderos also incorporate foreign tourists who come to be healed into their perceptions about engagements with apu and encantos. So therefore, Norteños' local narratives also become a global story, right? They could become a new possibility for collective engagement with the earth in the future. Now, one of the things that's really important now is how does this relate to science? Because as Mayfair pointed out before, there's been a lot of debate and people think about indigenous people as opposing science and so on, and that's really not the case at all. Norteños' reading of climate change are confirmed by science, and they become intermixed. Curanderos meld the agency and ethicality of apus and encantos expressed through natural disasters, dreams, and visions with scientific discourses and their own observations of environmental patterns and changes. So this makes their knowledge accessible to a large public. As Norteños can see the connections between the actions of apus and encantos, curanderos' biometric readings, and environmental science, they also understand the consequences of the overexploitation of the earth simultaneously in environmental, ethical, and social terms. Climate change has changed the time for rains, Ombayek told me. Before it rained in October or November, but now that has changed to March and April. And he went on. I knew El Niño was coming because the apple, okay, I don't know why this jumps ahead. Okay, I knew El Niño was coming because the apples showed me through visions, and the animals and plants showed me through their actions. The termites began to crawl out of the wood, and many dragonflies would feed on them. Spiders, insects, and snakes came down from the mountain and into the streets and houses, seeking refuge so they wouldn't drown. There was a huge number of herons, and the birds and animals were alarmed. I lit a candle, and it sputtered, a manifestation that there was a lot of human evil and lack of ethics, and that Apus would punish that with water. The pacay and guava trees bloomed early and lost their flowers and then got new ones. The zapote tree, which is small and grows in the ravines, started growing really, really tall and getting a lot of green leaves on the top because there was a lot of water accumulating underground. You see this sort of combination of knowledges that's occurring in this narrative? And here we have Mombayek with his mesa. So a Norteño biologist, Carlos Quiroz, commented, now, Ombayek is right. When the rain begins in the highlands, the first thing that fills up is the phreatic water layer underground. And once those are saturated, then rivers flow above. Many small springs can also emerge, and the seeds that were underground sprout, and then the whole desert becomes green with running water, frogs, insects, and deer. So it's clear the big rain is coming. Many Norteños, including scientists, talk about climate change as messages sent by Apus in dreams and visions, and as scientific predictions. So Carlos described scientific measurements alongside his own experience with an Apu. People dream about Apus becoming angry because of environmental devastation, and Apus as causing earthquakes and exploding with water to destroy the world. These experiences have a scientific basis. As temperature rises because of El Niño phenomenon, the atmospheric pressure over the mountain falls, and then winds move in from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure to compensate. The mountains on the coastal range are affected by the tropical rain that saturates the aquifers that run under the rocky surface. The low pressure areas generated by the high temperatures of the atmosphere make the water and the water tables rise and reach the surface of the mountains, dramatically increasing the water volume of the ravines, and then they explode. Earthquakes exacerbate this effect and therefore often occur together because of the water pressure produced by the water infiltrated under the surface. Apu also show you things that science cannot. We took the San Pedro cactus brew with a curandero named Julio, and he saw the Apu Campana as a mountain of crystal. The next day, we found an ancient moche crystal mines that moche artisans used to make marvelous necklace beads. Leonel, a disaster management worker and visionary, predicted enormous destruction in the region in the next 5 years, a result of subterranean waters flowing under the mountain Apus. He articulated this prediction by combining scientific discourses with local narratives and visions of Apu ancestor. Leonel says, 2 mountains will destroy this area in the next 5 years. San Ildefonso is the mother. She's receptive to all of the mountains. She loves her children, but she also teaches and punishes them. She will empty her waters on Trujillo and Chanchan, and the ravines from Campana will flood and destroy Huanchaco. Campana is the great-grandfather and the warrior, and he has tensions with all of the Apus. The Apu is becoming really green because it's filling with water. Before, the winds on Campana ran from north to south. Now they go from south to north. The hot and cold air will clash and create cyclones. Campana becomes drier, while other mountains are green, filled with water. The clash of the cold Humboldt current with the warm waters from El Niño will cause cyclones in the Pacific, and tsunamis of more than 30 meters will come from the sea and flood all the area to Chocope and Ascope. Or, as Ombayek said almost a year earlier, humans will eat disasters and anguish today and tomorrow. The reading of ancestral landscapes and those of scientists converge and overlap with each other. Both ontologies clarify that there's no time for complacency or the continuation of predatory capitalism, which is causing climate change and destroying the earth and its species. Both perspectives explain that citizen action and environmental conservation may postpone the cataclysmic end of humanity, but will not deter it. And according to both views, the world will continue to exist without humans. The difference between the scientific perspective and that of curanderos lies in that curanderos draw on an interspecies perspective to offer hope, while science does not. Ancestral landscapes reward humans who engage in planetary ethics by allowing them to exist as insects and birds in a post-apocalyptic world, while science remains focused on the imminent extermination of humanity and other species. So what does all of this mean? By fundamentally decentering humans' place in the world in the future, Shimbe and Kukulikote their critique offers a productive tool to promote environmental and climate justice now. From a curandero's perspective, Encantos and Apus promote collective ethics between humans and ancestral landscapes in places dramatically affected by the phenomenon of El Niño, exacerbated by climate change and extractive capitalism. Such an ethics, Ombayek argues, if widely practiced, would reduce environmental devastation caused by extractivism and, subsequently, the Apus who punish extractivists with floods. This would reshape Western understandings of the relationship between nature and culture, subject and object, the material and the spiritual. This hopeful vision for the near and medium-term future would certainly inspire people to respond to climate change. But even if the practice of an environmental crisis, even if the practice of a collective ethics and the use of climate change mitigation technologies reduces the immediate environmental crisis, it will not avert the end of humanity in the long run. Nevertheless, it gives humans a way to get involved in environmental consciousness and have hope, rather than become passive victims of the apocalypse with no hope and no future. Jose and Ombayek, through Shimbe and Kukulikote, show us a kind of post-apocalyptic visions that could trigger humans' moral responsibility towards the earth. From a scientific perspective, when our carbon emissions exceed what the earth sequesters, the earth will be uninhabitable for humans. From a curandero's perspective, when we let go of the possibility of long-term human survival and focus on our ethical relationship with ancestral landscapes and other species, we will postpone the end of humanity and reimagine our existence in a post-human world. By envisioning a return to a cyclical space-time ruled by ancestral landscapes, you might imagine being reborn in non-human form as a desirable and viable future. Our presence in this future, however, is contingent on our current ethical relations and to the extent that we're implicated in extractivism, climate change, and the Anthropocene. By reshaping our post-apocalyptic imaginaries as insects and birds in a future without humans, curanderos really are calling for decolonizing hierarchical exploitative relations between humans, other beings, and landscapes. Their apocalyptic visions enable us to gain awareness of the inevitable end of the space-time of modern industrial civilization and humanity, and a world that will continue to exist and be better without us, which will inspire us to respond to the climate crisis. The sacred adds a potency to these claims. The sacredness and the materiality of Apus and Encantos as ancestors represent ways of knowing that reach beyond the secular scientific narratives of climate change. Catastrophic climate change has historically inspired millenarian, apocalyptic, and subversive religions that transform the way we interpret and engage the world. For example, people like Philip Jenkins and Paul Boyer argue that the world's disasters and their consequences reflect and advertise the loss of divine support and create a new future. Shimben Kukulikote, their eschatological visions give us a new course of action to reduce suffering by envisioning our post-apocalyptic futures as non-humans. This subverts Christian eschatology that promises an eternity of heaven after the world is destroyed. The logics of ancestral landscapes and climate change discourses work together towards a common end. We scholars have to expand our methodologies and frameworks to incorporate local modes of ethical relationships with landscapes into our climate change discourses. Scholars often see the alternative logic of ancestral landscapes as incommensurable with Euro-American discourses of climate change deployed by scientists, but actually we have seen that they're profoundly commensurable. Both knowledge systems come to the same conclusion. We need to change our relationship to the earth if we need to meaningfully address climate change. Through the bodies and voices of Jose and Ombayek, these ancestral landscapes explain climate change by combining scientific readings of climate change with eschatological visions of the end of the world. Like some climate scientists, Shimbe and Kukulikote show us that climate change produced by extractivism and the warming of the climate and the burning of fossil fuels will exterminate humanity. These visions of an unavoidable extermination of humanity through these environmental catastrophes are consistent with many scientific predictions. The ethical breach in reciprocal relations between kin relations with ancestral landscapes thus has parallel ecological implications. And I think this is a really important point that the curanderos make. These narratives therefore have to be read together to visualize climate change and the post-apocalyptic futures devoid of humans, whose rebirth in non-human form is, in Jose and Ombayek's perspective, our only viable future. Those humans who break with the modern industrial civilization and re-engage ancestral landscapes will be able to reemerge in non-human form. In this utopic new space-time, those plants and animals will cooperate with ancestral landscapes to create community life, ruled by collective ethics of ancestral landscapes rather than profit and destruction. I've shown that ancestral landscapes define collective human and non-human ethics and climate justice through their direct and indirect actions visible in these cycles. And one of the things that curanderos also ask us to do as academics, as scholars, is to work to reverse climate change and the destruction of fossil fuel economies by becoming adept at translating between shamanic, indigenous knowledges, and so on, and these modern scientific knowledges and changing the lives and the global order. So it's actually, this issue of translation between different systems of knowledge is something that they're asking us to do. The insistence of ethical relations of exchange between humans and other beings promotes hope and action. For although the actions of one individual are not enough to stop climate change, such an effort is never worthless or futile as long as it strengthens these reciprocal relationships. I've shown what this means through the lens of Northern Peruvian shamanism, but there are many different ways in which humans can return to that moment that we belong to the earth. And I've heard by these wonderful papers in this conference that have shown that. Through the study of religion in diverse religious contexts, we can heal these epistemic fractures that we've inherited between humans and ecologies, time and space, and between the geopolitical and ecological. Engagements with the earth as an ancestor and material agent is what has led indigenous people around the world to seek transformational change and lead climate change movements. It's now time for the rest of humanity to join them. Thank you. Thank you, folks. I really appreciate that. I saw a lot of faces there with people, engaging with this, obviously thinking about your own work, so I'm really excited about that. Any questions or comments? Yes.
Thank you. I have so many questions, but I wondered if you could just say more about. So just to make sure I understand, so the humans who are cooperative, was it working? They can come back as birds or insects, and the other animals will still be around in this post-apocalyptic world. Is that right? And why? Can you say more about why birds and insects?
That's a real. Well, the animals who have not been wiped out by us, of course, will continue to exist in this world. The ones who have gone extinct won't be there anymore, but they will remain. I mean, roaches will definitely be there, right? They're one of the animals that survive the most. And plants or insects, they're interesting because, when I showed you that narrative of Ombayek, where he says, the termites are emerging from the rocks, the snakes and the spiders are coming down from the mountain and they're climbing up. What are they doing? Those animals know way before humans do that there's going to be a flood. And this is what curanderos are doing by the biometrics. They're looking at the animals. The animals know what humans do not, right? So the animals, the insects and the birds have a higher consciousness than humans do because they're closer to the apples. They're the messengers and the mediators. So this is why we have to view them. So being a plant or an insect is tremendous. You are basically, it's an incredible honor, right? Because you are closer to the apple and you are viewed as an intermediary with them because you've engaged with them, right? Plants are also incredible. The other narrative that I showed you is like the pacay trees, right, are basically growing twice their size. Why is that happening? Well, it's because of all the water that's going underground. So like one time I was walking with Ombayek, and he goes, look at that pacay tree. What is it showing you? Look at the pacay tree over there and look at the one over there. And here, this one's really short and this one's really, really tall. And at the beginning I said, I don't know. He's like, girl, it's the water. The water's underground. This is where the flood is coming. This is where it's coming. So all of those, the knowledge that plants and animals have and that we can learn from is way beyond what humans can observe, right? And the thing, because the underwater ground, all of these animals and insects react way before humans can. And this is what it's actually telling us. I actually was, I said, well, what am I going to be? Am I going to come back in the next world? They're like, oh, yes, you will. You'll be back and you'll be cricket. Yeah, and the reason, crickets are, they make music for the other animals. So they create a sense of collective community and they want people to participate, and also it's because I like to talk a lot, and so that's the noisy cricket, right? And if need be, I'm also a source of protein, right, for all the birds and other things, so that's a very useful, being to be in the other world. So every person, they think about the way how you're coming back. It also depends on your characteristics. Ombayek, for example, is coming back as an owl. An owl is a night bird, but he also deals a lot with the dead, and he has all this relationship with the dead, so they're able to mediate between different things. Owl and hummingbirds are the two birds he could come back with. Another curandero that I know would come back as an eagle, which eagles are it's very interesting. Many times when I've been to the apples, the eagles start circulating around, And you're like, well, I said, what's happening? He's like, well, it's the apple who's recognizing that we're here. We better do a ritual quickly so that, they're embracing us rather than just observing us. And it was interesting because the eagle sat on one of these pre-Columbian, it's a petroglyph, sat on the petroglyph. And you can see that there was bird shit all over the petroglyph. I'm like, that petroglyph happens to be the most powerful one that gives off energy that heals shamans. And that's where the eagles go. Right, so there's a relationship also between rocks and animals and the ability to read this. So the moment that the bird was watching us do the ritual, while he sat on the rock being healed, was also a way of saying, okay, you can be part of our circle. Let me teach you about how to manage this. So those things are really important. Learning the language of animals and plants, learning the language of rocks and so on. Ombayek was possessed many times by that petroglyph, which is it was a petroglyph made by Moche way back, and it was a mountain. It was a triangular head. I'm sorry I didn't bring it today, or maybe it was on that. No, it's actually on one of the slides. Maybe I'll try and find it later. I'll find it now. So let's see if I can find it. I'm sorry if you're going to get dizzy while I do this. Go back there. Oh, I showed a lot of slides, didn't I? Okay. Yeah, I think it was further back than this. So I mean, what I'm trying to say here is that it's really important to think about these different languages that we have been oblivious to, that we haven't learned. It took me a while to learn all these different languages of the earth and what they mean and how to read the landscape in the ways that Bayek taught me. Okay, here we go, this one. All right, you can't really... Okay, this is on the side. So oh no, you can see it. You see that there's a figure here. There's a triangular head, which is the mountain, right? And it also has the rhomboid here in the stomach. That is the mountain and the heart of the mountain. And then coming out from it are these wings. So it's also bird. The bird is the messenger. And you have these feet, which they have claws on them. So it's part feline as well. And it's basically the mountain showing its different manifestations, but you can become part of the mountain, the heart, the rhomboid in the middle, if you engage with it. And here is Bayek being healed by the petroglyph. Right? He's healed and he's being possessed by it. I didn't take a picture of him being possessed because that, it's a violation of the kinds of forms. But this is where he gets energy and healed from. So her learning how to engage these different things and what we can learn from that, I think, is profoundly important. And I'm sure all of you study different religious traditions around the world, and you have different ways in which you can learn. You've learned, right, and engaged with nature in these different ways. And it'd be really important, I think, to bring those languages into your writings and so on, and kind of show this as an important way in which we can think about the earth, right? I loved your presentation in that way too. I was really moved by it. It's so important. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna Mariella, for your fascinating research and talk. You asked Mayfair earlier whether this notion of key was being translated into affinity with and promotion of the notion of the rights of nature, personhood of rivers and mountains and so forth. Now, your research is in Northern Peru, and I think you said there's Quechua ancestry among these folks. And of course, just nearby in Bolivia and Ecuador, they're the first places that passed legislation on the rights of nature, and that's kind of spread around the world as indigenous people increasingly encounter one another and learn from one another, and also are engaged with activists of various sorts. So I'm wondering, these folks wanted to reach out also, but I'm wondering if they've also been influenced by their neighbors, and if that kind of rhetorics of personhood of rivers, mountains, and the rights of nature is also kind of resonating there and being expressed and promoted.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. That's part of the things I'm writing about, but I didn't have really time to talk about that today. It's a really important question, and we also have the context in where they're living in a particular state, right? And the Peruvian state, unfortunately, recognizes personhood as restricted to humans and to companies, right? So what they're doing, though, is that people are very aware of this, and so they're working with, and this is different, the recognition of what the personhood of nature means radically different things in different countries. So in Bolivia, if people are like, okay, Pachamama, everybody recognizes Pachamama, the Mother Earth, as being a person and so on, but what does that really mean in Bolivia? Nothing. Why? Because the mining, it's lip service, right? And people are happy that you recognize that, but what does it mean practically? Well, no, the mines continue to exploit things. There's no restrictions. If you blow up, an indigenous site, or if you use a mining and contaminated river, there are no consequences for you, right? So it's very different from what happens in New Zealand, for example, when you're thinking about what happens there. You are accountable legally if you contaminate a river and so on. But they have been working with Ecuadorian lawyers. We were able to connect with some of those, and some of those Ecuadorian lawyers have been working with us to see how we can sort of, I don't want to talk about manipulate because it sounds terrible, but how can we think about the Peruvian constitution in ways to think about, well, these are corporations, right? But thinking about them as corporations of indigenous people with the earth. And so that way you can have that recognition, the recognition of a corporation as a person, and that is the definition of corporation. So we have been working with that. Unfortunately, in Peru right now, it's a little bit, I don't know if you've heard about the news, but it's in a difficult moment in time. So they have been a number of requests and intents in Peru to have the recognition of different apus, mountains, as ancestors. And so far, they have not been successful, but now there's this new attempt to do this as a corporation, you know, and that's one of the attempts now with the Apu Campana, which is the one that had these 3 movements based of that, is basically to think about this as a corporation of indigenous people with mountain ancestor, and so therefore they have the legal recognition. And the Ecuadorian lawyers have been fantastic in trying to help us make this happen, because they have all this experience, and how do you work with the law in order to do that. So I really hope that it works. And yes, they do have a lot of relationship with different places and thinking about how personhood is recognized there. If anybody who's done, I mean, I know that Greg does all this work on the law and the earth and so on. If they really say, hey, we really want people who want to do an internship here, who want to engage this. So if you have anybody that you know about who speaks Spanish, who would like to go, please let me know and I'll connect you, with them, because it's a work in progress, and it's something that they really want to accomplish, right? I mean, one of the things that I find is quite extraordinary about this movement is that since 2014, this movement started and it's taken off like wildfire. And I think it's probably one of the reasons is that this area is going to be the end of the world for them. You know, these people will all die within 10 years, right? It's not, there's a huge kind of awareness of this. And so what are they going to do in the meanwhile to manage this and to create a better future for those people who do survive in other places, you know, there and in other places? And I think, you know, the knowledge comes from suffering, right? And catastrophe and so on. And they're really creating, I think, a model to think about this beyond beyond a local community. I have been really heartened by the way in which a lot of American tourists who come, they come for the surf, right? You like surf, you know all about this. But they come for the surf and then they stay to be healed by a mountain. And then suddenly you're like, wow, you know, they're like, I was healed by the mountain. This is what happens. And they're the ones who give donations to those movements. So all this is funded by foreign tourists, actually, who give donations and pay really well for these healing rituals in ways that locals cannot do. So it's been really beneficial in this way. And then also it's been involved people tend to think about, indigenous knowledge, well, it belongs to this community, but the local population or the larger, broader population doesn't participate. That's not the case in Peru. You know, when I first came in and I'm like, oh yes, I want to work with apples. They're like, oh, nobody believes in that stuff anymore. It doesn't exist and whatever. And shamans, oh no, they don't. It doesn't happen either. I said, actually, last night I was at a healing ritual with a curandero, and we were healed by apu so-and-so. And they're like, oh, okay. Well, and then like, well, just a minute, let me show you my own misa, which is like my own ritual thing. And they pull it out from underneath their desks, right? And so, you know, there's this whole underground movement, right, where you have people like I've seen in the healing rituals, the ministers come, you know, all the people in the local government come. I mean, there are all of these people who have been profoundly affected by this in their personal lives and are engaging with it. The issue is, how can you make this more public? Right? How can you make this more recognizable, right? And one of the things that we've been doing is trying to create a change in public policy by having indigenous waterways, the management of the indigenous waterways, Chimu waterways and so on, and have that be a way to manage natural disasters of El Nino, because they're way more effective than what the government has done. They put these little blocks up and the flood comes and takes them down in a minute, whereas the indigenous waterways, they have it moving like a snake like this, and every curve of the snake, they have these little canals going out. It's incredibly effective. So by having that be recognized and used practically as a way to manage natural disasters, natural disaster risk management, and have that become local policy in all the north of Peru, effectively what you're doing is recognizing the apus. So that's one of the things it's another project that we're doing. I know it's kind of a long answer, I'm sorry. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, you were talking, something that came to mind is the similarity between what you're talking about and the worldview expressed in movies by the Japanese animated filmmaker Miyazaki, who's from Studio Ghibli films with Totoro, Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, these films. And it seems like there is such rich, mutually beneficial ground here for collaboration with Studio Ghibli or with another such group. Studio Ghibli is, of course, very famous in the world, very renowned and regarded in the world. And I'm curious if there's been any thought about, because it seems like they would be in favor of having their wisdom and knowledge spread in that way, yes. And if there's discussion of collaborating with such more pop cultural influences that do have a power to transform the message into something that would be spreadable that way.
I think that's a great question. Come and see me later, and we'll talk about that. I think I mean, on the one hand, I think they really want their message to be spread. On the other hand, if you reduce it to anime, I'm not sure how that would work. Is that you're thinking about? Because they really want to think about this as not something that is theoretical or in the imagination. These are mountains, and there are floods, right? And the mountains, when they are giving you fertile earth and they're watered with earth, you eat, and when they don't, you don't eat, right? I mean, there's an immediacy to that, and it's not just about imagination or religion. There is the mountain is a sacred being. It is also, you can think about it in terms of water management, precisely. You can think about it as a political territory. It's about farmland. It's about a lot of different things. So I don't know if separating those out would be beneficial to them. One of the things that they're really trying to do is to bring those together and to understand Apu, this is our livelihood. Without them, we die. And it's literally true, because the water comes from the top of the mountains, and they need to be able to manage these floods in a way that's beneficial. I mean, the mudslides can be fantastic for irrigating, farmland, if you're able to manage them. But if they're completely out of control, of course, they'll destroy everything. So I am a little hesitant. I mean, I'd have to speak to them about it, but I'm a little hesitant to think about this as separate from material needs, of eating and water resources and clean water and management of the earth in this way, and political sovereignty over land that belongs to them, which has been encroached in by the mines, right? The over-romanticization of that can bring problems, right? Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I'd love to talk to you more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariella. Anna Mariella. I thought that was fantastic, your talk. I had a particular question. I noticed among the accoutrements of the shamans you showed, they often have Jesus portraits, or sometimes I think Marian imagery, and given the old Lynn White Jr. thesis that this is the Christian tradition is part of the roots of our ecological crisis, Could you speak to that? How they how they understand
it's
that
interesting.
imagery?
That's interesting. Thank you very much for bringing up that question. And I'm sorry I didn't talk about that more, because it's really important. One of the things that has happened here, as in many indigenous traditions, is that you have a lot of Catholic symbols, particularly, right? Because this is not the evangelical Jesus. This is the Catholic Jesus, and there's a big difference between them. All right. That you have a resignification of those beings in local terms. So, for example, what the missionaries did is they put a cross on top of all the mountains. They say, okay, this is how we colonize. But the locals are like, oh, okay, so Jesus has decided to give his life force to the Apu. Isn't that beautiful? Right? I mean, the Apus will eat our life force when we die, but Jesus made the sacrifice to put his life force into the Apu. So this is his ultimate sacrifice. He died on the cross for the Apus. And so when you have Jesus there, that is what it's talking about. right? It's not Jesus. And there are Apus, for example, that have much more ambivalent feelings. There's a saint, I don't know if you're familiar with Saint Cyprian. Do you guys know about Saint Cyprian, the Catholic saint? Well, you know, Saint Cyprian, I mean, the local story goes in Peru that Saint Cyprian was this person who did a lot of sorcery and so on, and he falls in love with this Christian woman, and he wants to become Christian in order to, seduce her and so on and be her partner. So Saint Cyprian, essentially what he has is he has these two sides. He has the healing side, he has the side of sorcery, and then also the issue is sorcery for whom, right? So if you're basically doing sorcery to the mining companies to get off your land, well, isn't that just protecting the Apu? I mean, are you really doing sorcery or not? So there's a question there. And that ambivalence, right, is like who gets to decide what is good or bad? Why is it always the upper class? Why is it always the mining companies? Why is it always Christianity on their terms, right? So this is a different way of thinking about this, right? And one of the things that's happened is that Saint Cyprian used to be part of the Catholic Church. They don't recognize Saint Cyprian anymore because Saint Cyprian has become curandero's saint. So the songs of the curanderos, they go, San Cipriano, curandero, vamos ando, and they're there with the rattle, because he is the epitome of bringing together these different kind of powers, the power of heal, the power to cause illness, right? And the Apus themselves do that. You know, they can give you life and water to be able to give your crops and so on. They can also destroy you with a flood. Right, so it really depends on your relationship with them and how you manage that, which I think is the key teaching of the curanderos, right? So there's a lot of the Marian imagery, right? Virgin Mary. Well, this also is common like among many indigenous people. I'm like, okay, so what does virgin mean? You know? And they're like, well, virgin, like queen, powerful, fertile. I'm like, oh, okay. So I said, you know what virginity means in Spanish? It's like this whole thing of not having slept with anybody. They're like, well, what would that be? That's ridiculous. We don't want any part of that. We want a virgin who is powerful, who is fertile, who is strong. And that's what they get of the image of the Virgin Mary. So the Virgin Mary is added to the mountain with the powers of Jesus to make it fertile. So you can have a lot of Marian images, for example, associated with rivers, put near rivers to make the rivers fertile and to try and decontaminate the rivers from heavy metals produced by the mines. Apparently the Virgin Mary can do that. So there's ways in which these Catholic powers are reinterpreted in local terms, right? So I don't even really want to talk about syncretism here because it's really an appropriation and complete transformation of what these things mean, you know? Anyway, I hope that answers your question.
We're going to do one final question.
Yes. I don't know why I'm holding this up here like it's some sort of like rod to catch the powers of the universe. Yes.
So I wanted to say, Koyana, for your presentation. Hi, I'm up here.
Wait, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. Yes.
No, you're good, you're good. Your presentation, I so appreciated the centering of the Encanto and the Apu. I'm reminded when I read Amitav Ghosh, the Nutmeg's Curse, and he has a line in there that says, what if the trees are just waiting for us to die? And I grew up around Duwamish and Coast Salish trees, and when I read that line, I felt the most profound sense of comfort and peace about that my death might feed a tree, and that this might be what climate change happens. So I love hearing that resonance. My question comes because I am a registered descendant of the Bering Straits Native Corporation, which is an Native Alaska Native Corporation up near Nome. And I'm curious about the move to try to incorporate the mountain, the Apu, and the people as a corporate entity within the political system, because for Native Alaskans, of course, when that happened, we lost our rights. And it happened because they wanted to build a pipeline. And now in our communities, there's at least some discussion about the difficulties or the incorporation, let's say, of corporate language into even like Inupiaq. So like what used to be a share of a whale is now also a share in the corporation, which then can participate in things like oil extraction and is there for the benefit of the shareholders, right? So it's become sort of entangled in problematic ways, and I'm curious about whether the norteños are in conversation with Native Alaskans, or whether they've been thinking about sort of this. Yeah.
It would be lovely if we could talk about that, and you could bring, that concern in. I think it's a very important question, and I also think there's always a tension when you think about local communities. Like, well, when do we keep our knowledges sacred and to ourselves to protect ourselves, and when do we share it, right? And in the case of Norteños, I'll just start with that and then I'll talk about the corporation. But in the case of Norteños, since they are from many different communities, and a lot of people that are white as well, they're really working from a place. They don't want to talk about ethnic identity because that divides them, right? And the last thing they want is to divide people. They want people to come together to create a movement against, basically, it's the whole kind of the corporate issues and also the government. It is true that it's dangerous. It's very dangerous. The question is, the Alaskan Natives had rights. These people have no rights. Nothing, nada, zilch, right? And so they're trying to find a way, a language with which to try and create something that will allow them to protect. At this moment, they have no protection whatsoever. None. And the north of Peru was heavily colonized by, one of the things in Peru which is very important, right, to acknowledge is that Peru only recognizes as indigenous people the people in the Amazon. Okay? All the people in the Andes, the people that you've all heard about, right, and the Quechua, the Aymara, and all of those people, they're not recognized as indigenous in the Constitution. They put them as campesinos, right? That means farmers, right? And that is one of the things the Norteños are trying to do is like, well, we can't recognize ourselves as indigenous, or try to gain that recognition, because then that means, well, I'm Chimu, but you're not. So then where does it leave our community? And how do we recognize who is Chimu or not? So they don't want to go that route. And also in Peru, it's a very incredibly colonial, political kind of manipulation that created that idea that only an Amazonian people were indigenous. Because there are smaller groups that can be more easily controlled. It's like, okay, recognize them, but not the Quechua and the Aymara, who have a lot more force, right, and ability to protest and so on. I mean, these people in the Andes were the ones who basically protested against the current president, and hordes of them were killed, right? They were basically fighting against the mines. So what do you do in a country where you have no rights and you haven't even been recognized as indigenous? What do you do, right? Because the Norteños actually you could recognize them as an indigenous group, pan-indigenous, but indigenous, right? So they're struggling to seek for a language with which they can manage this. At the moment, they have nothing. They have certain kind of, the university, for example, owns Apucampana. Universidad de Trujillo. There's supposed to be a protection of it. That's just why they allow that to happen. But there's really no protection that happens. These people who are coming in, the mining companies, the people who have their chicken farms and so on, they come with like guns, right? And there is nobody who can literally stop them. I mean, the level of corruption in Peru is huge, right? So what can you do to create a kind of protection? And ironically, in Peru, the people who are protected are corporations. And that's why they've tried to look into that. It's a dangerous move. I don't know if it will be effective. They will obviously be a counter movement to that and so on, but their corporations are already there. The mining companies already have the blessing of the government. Even though the government says, oh yes, we'll protect the environment and all the rest of it, behind the back they're giving all of these rights to Canadian, European, and American, and also Mongolian mining companies. Peru is basically just a place for people to extract. It's the extractive zone, right? So what do you do to protect yourself? If you have, this is their logic, thinking if we become a corporation, we will have the same protections that the mining companies have as corporations. And that's their goal, to create this corporation between the community and the Apus. They're struggling with what they have. I agree that it's, Audre Lorde talks about, this way in which using the master's tools will never dismantle, right? The master's house and all of that. Well, in this particular case, what do they have to lose, right? I mean, they're already in a place of extermination, right? So this is what they're trying to do. But I would really like it if you could come and talk to me, and maybe we can, think about ways in which to help them with their project, and collaborating with the Alaskan Natives would be fantastic, and I really want to thank you for putting that forth.
Please join me in thanking Mariella once more for her keynote.